It is so crazy to think that I have been making content for 4 years now. Now, this channel has been growing slowly, but steadily. So, as I usually open, welcome friends, enemies, and everyone in between to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am, of course, The Masked Mormon.
Why you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
I am a Mormon who did everything the church expected me to do. I paid tithing, I served a mission, I got married in the temple, and served wherever the church wanted me to. Then my faith fell as I started to notice that what the church promised and what it delivered just didn't match up. The church makes a lot of falsifiable claims that can be tested. As my lived experience built up, I found I just didn't have any data to support the church's claims anymore. The faith crisis was pretty intense and thrust me into quite an existential crisis. But as I worked through it, I was able to mourn the loss and deal with the feelings of betrayal. Then, one day, I was doing dishes, and while I was elbow deep in dishwater, I had the thought that I wanted to start a YouTube channel. But what would it be about? Several ideas popped up. I could do something science related or any number of other topics that I have interest in. But there's a lot of other content creators that do a better job at that than I do. But even after my faith crisis, I still found Mormonism to be fascinating. And as cliche as alliteration is, the name Masked Mormon came up almost immediately. All of a sudden, it's 4 years later. And I want to thank those of you who have followed me all this time, and to those of you who are new, I'm glad that you're here. And even those of you who hate what I do because you feel that it is an attack on what you find most sacred, I'm still glad that you're here as well. Now, I haven't done a comment response in a very long time, so I wanted to share some of the comments that you, my viewers, have shared over the last couple of videos. There have been some great comments, both supportive and critical of the position I take. I always try to keep my responses respectful and focus on systems and not on the people. If there are any other topics that you would like me to cover in the future, feel free to leave some of those ideas down in the comments. So, let's get into it. The first comment comes from C.K. McKnight 8921. Quote, "In the few years or so following my mission, I fell on some pretty hard times. I had always paid my tithing. The leaders of the church always say that paying tithing brings you prosperity or whatever. But I wasn't seeing that during those years. It just felt like it was dragging me further into poverty. It has always been difficult for me to ask for help, and I certainly felt that as I spoke with my bishop. It felt intrusive having him go through my finances and figure out exactly what I needed. This may or may not have been the intention, and I suppose the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But I was made to feel that I was a burden on the church. Ultimately, as I deconstructed, I realized that this was backwards. That this multi-million-dollar church and its demands for tithing had been a burden on me. Then there are the temple recommend questions. Am I a full tithe payer? Or perhaps more accurately, will you pay in a monetary sense to receive the blessings of heaven? There was a word for that during the Dark Ages with the Catholic Church. It was the selling of indulgences." End quote. C.K. McKnight, thanks for sharing your experience. Now, it does seem like an intrusion of the bishop to go into your finances. I remember when I was an elders quorum president, I was tasked with doing that. And it always felt so awkward. Me, just some engineer who, has a regular day job, going into other people's homes and frankly, intruding into something that should be kind of private, I guess. So it was super awkward just going through people's cupboards and asking them about their finances and things that they spend their money on. And then ultimately, when you kind of think about it, the demand that people pay their tithing, the monetary value of that tithing that just goes into some investment account for the church would likely be worth more to the person paying it than it is to the church. All of the financial pressure that they have wouldn't likely go away if they had that 10% back, but it would certainly take a lot of pressure off. But yeah, the church totally does tie the receipt of blessings with financially giving to the church. And that does sound a lot like indulgences. Now, a believer will, of course, try to push back on that and say, like, no, you're not forced to pay tithing. But kind of you are. Like, if you want to go to the temple, you have to pay. If you want to attend a loved one's wedding or see them off on a mission and go to their first endowment, you have to pay. If you want to receive those blessings for yourself, you also have to pay. If you want your spouse to be sealed to you forever, you have to pay. And how Mormonism sees the tiers of heaven, with exaltation, the highest level of heaven, being reserved for men and women that are sealed together, the only way to get that is if you receive the blessings of the temple. So essentially, you're tying people's salvation to whether or not they pay a tithing. And that does sound a lot like an indulgence. And then the church's accumulation of wealth also reminds me of an episode of The Simpsons, when instead of competing with Homer's online business, Bill Gates comes in and destroys it. When Homer asks why he's doing it, Bill Gates says, "I didn't get rich by writing a lot of checks." And that just kind of reminds me of the church. The second comment comes from Scott Ken. Quote, "Whomever this person is, they are playing on the misunderstanding of doctrines of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and a person's natural tendency to think and believe in a concept that Mark Antony revealed to mankind via the masterpiece written by William Shakespeare, or was it Sir Francis Bacon, is always true. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. Having been a member all my life, and one that had my own struggles, I can tell you that no one is compelled or forced to pay tithing. That in temple recommend interviews, one is never asked details about their personal finances beyond, do you pay an honest tithe? And when either families or individuals are in need of assistance from the ward or the bishop in regards to rent, utilities, or needing food from the bishop's storehouse, the interviews are normally done with the bishop or Relief Society president, depending on what the needs are. No one is asked or demanded to pay on either a member's net or gross or excess funds, since it is never expressly mentioned anywhere in the church in regards to the specifics beyond your increase. Disingenuous videos such as this one do neither the creator, the honest viewer, nor a member of the church any service or credit." End quote. So, Scott Ken, can you be a member without paying a tithing? Technically, yes. But if you want to be a member in full standing with a temple recommend, then you must pay. If you want to attend the temple, you must pay. The church will say that it is optional in one breath, and then in the next it describes the law of tithing. Now let me ask you this. Are laws optional? Then it will use Malachi to ask, will a man rob God? Now again, robbing someone seems like it's pretty serious, don't you think? Then the church will describe tithing as an obligation. Now I don't know about you, but again, obligations don't sound like things that are very optional. The church has taught that those who pay tithing won't be burned at the second coming, colloquially calling it fire insurance. Now, these all sound like pretty serious considerations if someone isn't going to pay tithing, don't you think? The next comment comes from ACC-AU. Quote, We used to pay tithing on gross income until I did my own deconstruction of the history of the law and realized it was a lot simpler than church tradition had made it out to be. 1/10 of your interest annually, where interest used to be defined as increase, the church now defines it as income. Quote, the simplest statement we have of the statement of the Lord himself, namely, that the members of the church should pay 1/10 of all their interest annually, which is understood to mean income. No one is justified in making any other statement than this. This was quoted from the First Presidency letter in March of 1970. There is incredible latitude available to members in living this law, and any constraint beyond what the First Presidency has stated is not either to the letter or the spirit of the law. In other words, the way you define your income and consequently your tithing is a matter between you and the Lord. Now, in general, I would agree. Like, I have no problem with people wanting to donate to the church or to whatever they want to donate to. Where I do have a problem is where the cultural pressure is for people to pay either on their net income or their gross income. You'll be hard pressed to find anybody in the church, especially through official channels, advocating for paying tithing on your surplus. In fact, you'll probably have a lot of resistance, even from leaders of the church. They'll probably tell you that you aren't paying a full tithe if you pay on your increase. So this can be a problem. So yes, there could be some cultural issues there. And ultimately, when you're sitting before a bishop, you can kind of define on your own what tithing is. But if you kind of share that with a bishop and he doesn't agree with you, he might not consider you a full tithe payer, and he might revoke your temple recommend or not issue you one if you're in there for a temple recommend. So there is a lot of cultural pressure on what tithing is, and it usually revolves around net or gross, nothing else. And that's where kind of the problem happens, because if you pay on your net or gross income, that eats into a lot of your discretionary income if you're more middle income or lower income of a person. And so this can be a problem because all of a sudden you can't save up for the future because you're feeding a multi-billion-dollar church. The next comment comes from J. Lilliburn 391. Just saw your channel. Why do so many ex-Mormons still call themselves Mormons? Always makes me wonder why you have trouble moving on. You know something, J. Lilliburn? That is a great question. Now, Mormonism gets into your bones, especially if you get into it when you're young. I was a teenager when I joined the church, and I took its prescriptions very seriously. It ultimately infiltrates every aspect of your life, from how you think, to what you eat, to whom you date and sleep with, how you talk, how you view other people, what you spend your money on, how you spend your time, how you raise your kids, how you mediate your relationship with God, etc. Mormonism reshapes who you are as a person, and many of those things don't just get turned off when you stop believing. Granted, a lot of people, probably the majority of them, once they stop believing, they totally leave the church and they never turn back. And that's totally fine. Other people like me, or your John DeLynns, or your Bill Reels, or your Radio Free Mormons, still for whatever reason find Mormonism fascinating and like to continue talking about it. I still find a connection with Mormonism even though I don't believe in it anymore. And also, Mormonism is a proselytizing religion. Those same urges and things that a person was taught from the time they were a child still exist to tell people what you learn once you find out it doesn't live up to its truth claims. As for myself, even though I no longer believe, like I said, I still find Mormonism fascinating, and I like to talk about it. So that's why I don't just, as they say, leave it alone. The next comment comes from Outlawed Media 4336. Quote, my 2 cents. Personally, I don't call myself Mormon anymore, and I don't know many ex-Mormons who do. But when a faith such But when a faith was such a huge part of your life, and you still have many Mormons in your family and friend group, you can't help but think about it well after leaving the church. Nothing is black and white, but many shades of gray. I think if all of your Mormon friends and family left all at once, then you'd move on very quickly without ever looking back. But sadly, that rarely happens, and the religion lingers on as a sensitive topic among those that still are in the faith. So this kind of goes back to that last comment. And I agree, a lot of people can leave it behind, but because Mormonism can be a multi-generational type of religion, if one person or a couple people or even an entire family leaves, they still have connections that might be in the church still. I was a convert and none of the rest of my family joined the church, so it wasn't really a big deal when I stopped believing. But my wife, the mass mistress, still has a lot of family that are still very much believers. And so when she started going through her faith crisis, it became kind of complicated how to navigate that. You know, if she was drinking coffee or not wearing her garments, how would she navigate that with her family? Because they would obviously notice those sorts of things. How do you broach that topic? So yeah, it becomes very difficult. But then again, like I said previously, some people still find Mormonism fascinating even after no longer believing in it anymore. So yeah, thanks for that great comment. The next comment comes from Boys R Us 61. Do you remember a few years ago during conference when one of the leaders, maybe Anderson, said that it was okay to pay donations to charities you like, but that was not tithing? Pay your tithing first. And I think Boys R Us was continuing a comment, but I think it got cut off. So yeah, the church defines tithing as paying 1/10 of your income to the church. Now, people that might stop believing in the concept of tithing, or they don't want to pay it to the church but still pay 1/10 of their income to a charity of their choice, that's not technically considered tithing. And so the church might say that, yeah, go ahead and pay to these charities, but we're not going to consider that tithing. Especially if you bring it up to your bishop at a temple recommend interview, he'll likely consider you a non-full tithe payer. The church does get a lot of mileage out of Malachi 3. You know, will a man rob God? But they also forget about most of the teachings of Jesus. Like, I don't know, even as you have done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. Outlawed Media 4336 also gives another comment. Compliment, it looks like. Mr. Mormon, I just want to say thank you for creating these very short, easy to digest videos of the illogical theology of Mormonism. It's helped me deconstruct my issues from complex to easy to remember points when my very strong Mormon family debate with me. I used to lose those debates, but now I'm winning and they hate it. Well, thank you so very much, Outlawed Media. My goal with these videos is partly for me to kind of tell some aspects of my own story, but also I like analyzing things. I like analyzing data. I like looking at things with a scientific mind. And so that's really fun to me, breaking things down and being like, well, that doesn't really make sense because this and this and this, and this makes these claims, so you should be able to see this, this, and that. And I'm glad that how I present things makes it easy for you to talk with some others. So I'm so glad that my content has been helping you with your deconstruction. And like I said, I try to make things as accessible as possible. But I do hope that in your debates with your family, if there's a good relationship there, that it can be maintained. I love the Mormon people. I just take issue with the organization. So sometimes getting into debates with people can sometimes harm relationships. So that's not something I want for any of my viewers. Now, sometimes those relationships are fraught for whatever reason, and they might not be salvageable. But I want to try to preserve relationships as much as possible, and that's why I try to interact with all my viewers, those that agree with me and even those that disagree with me, as respectfully as possible and focus on the topic at hand and not so much like ad hominem attacks and things like that, because it can so easily spiral into things like that. But I'm so glad that my content can be so helpful to you. And Outlawed Media continues saying, "You're so lucky to have a spouse that was equally critical about the church as you were. I have family members who refuse to look at the issues and look down at me as a core whore and a black sheep of the family, all because I'm pointing out the holes in the sinking ship." Now, outlawed, it was very scary at first. I didn't know if my wife, the mass mistress, I didn't know what she would do once I started telling her that I didn't believe anymore. I'd heard so many stories of spouses breaking up the marriage because one person doesn't believe anymore. I was scared that that could happen. Fortunately, that didn't. When my wife, the mass mistress, started thinking about things as I started sharing and opening up with her more, she made a specific choice of she chose the marriage and not the church. Now, I know this isn't always the case, but we were able to work through it. And eventually she had a faith crisis of her own for very different reasons than I did. She didn't really care about the truth claims like I did. For her, what kind of kicked it off was realizing that the church wouldn't take care of you in kind of a critical situation. She heard the story of a couple of sister missionaries that were assaulted, and the church really did nothing for them. And she thought back to her mission and all the dangerous situations that she'd been in and realized that had something happened, the church didn't have her back. Now, I realize not everyone has the same experience I did, but I hope that your family at least softens to kind of where you're at. Tim Minahan E2V says, "I think you should look at the Christian view. Giving should be an act of love and gratitude, like the way you would support your parents." Now, I agree. Giving should be done willingly. I have no problems with people giving to their chosen church or charity or whatever. I do have a problem with churches or charities or whatever taking advantage of their people and of the generosity that those people have. But yes, all these things should be done willingly. I totally agree with you. Chris Murphy 7711 says, "God has been merciful. How many tens of billions killed by wars, murders, slavery, cancer, pestilence, poverty, and starvation?" Now, you make a good point. You know, a lot of people will have their God of the lost car keys kind of experience, but then when you kind of compare that to all of the terrible things that are happening in the world, while God is apparently helping you find your car keys, it really does kind of draw a huge distinction. I live in Florida, and a few years back there was a hurricane heading right towards us, and at the last minute it veered away, and people talked about how blessed we were from God, only for the hurricane to really wreak a lot of destruction on some other people. It's like, wait a minute, God favored us, but then he just kind of clobbered these other people? That doesn't really make any sense. And so when you kind of think about things like that, it's like, okay, let's just slow the roll here. Let's just think that there's terrible things that are happening all over the world, and I don't know if we can really ascribe some of the good things that happen in our lives to God when there's so many terrible things that are going on as well. Chris Murphy 7711 says again, "General Conference equals repetitions, not revelations." Now, General Conference is probably the most boring gym ever. The general authorities have you put in so many reps of the same thing over and over and over again. Now, one of the things that really kicked off my faith crisis was realizing that I was just repeating things over and again. Like, if I were in 6th grade and I had to take that over and over again, that'd get really old after a couple of years. Now, don't get me wrong. As you can probably tell, I do like going to the gym. I put in lots of repetitions, but that's kind of a totally different thing. They then continue, "What I hated was stake conference when I was a little kid. Clearly didn't understand what was being said for 2 hours having to sit on a metal chair." Now, I totally understand it. But even as a believer, I always took stake conference as a bye week. George Martin 1383 says, but know God because bad things and he don't do what I want? I don't quite understand what you're meaning there, George Martin. But no God because there's really no convincing evidence for such a being. Now, I wish a benevolent God did exist, or at least that there was evidence for a benevolent God. But wishing for things and reality are very different things. Well, I think that's enough for today. I will probably do one of these types of videos from time to time. Now, one of the benefits of this channel being as small as it is that I can respond to all of the comments, and I do enjoy interacting with all of you. A few of you I've gotten to know a little bit via your comments. Now, I hope you all enjoy my content as much as I enjoy making it. Again, if you have something to share, please leave a comment. And if you like what I do, please press the like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.